Thursday, October 27th, 2016. The time was 12:30 p.m. The calls happened in rapid succession, each call quickly escalating from fear and panic to shock and disbelief. My phone rang again. It was an eternal moment of brief silence. I knew. She's dead, isn't she? Oh, Mom. My oldest son, Preston, let out the most gut-wrenching, agonizing sob I had ever heard. Sydney, his oldest sister, who was also his best friend, was dead. Only moments before, Preston had received calls from his cousin Lauren and Sydney's friend Frankie telling them that they hadn't heard from Sydney since late Tuesday night. That was the last time anyone would see her alive. The realization hit me with the full force of a wrecking ball. My head felt like it exploded, spinning with no sense of direction, no clear consciousness. I hysterically searched my mind to think, to act. Only I was mentally paralyzed. Vomit burned my throat. I couldn't take a breath. I can only describe it as an out-of-body experience, playing in slow motion, yet seemingly spiraling out of control at warp speed. I have never felt such an intense pain in my life. It was as if somebody ripped my heart out from my chest with crushing, unrelenting force, leaving a gaping, Sydney-sized hole. I believe a part of my heart died in that moment, and I am forever changed. We all are. My thoughts turned to my firefighting husband. I knew I must tell him that his daughter, our firstborn child, was dead. Unbeknownst to us at that time, his co-workers from the fire department were the Wrens who ran on the response to Sydney's apartment. They found her body. At least Steve didn't have to hear about her death from a co-worker. It was a blessing he was at the station when I called. He answered the phone. Steve, Sid's dead. Sydney's dead. She's at her apartment. Our new reality was a waking nightmare. Everything we had imagined would never be. I raced to her apartment. While frantically calling 911, I kept praying, pleading, and hoping. Please don't let it be her. Please, please do not let it be her. Saw the yellow crime tape as I pulled up. It was blocking a large portion of the complex as to the entrance to her apartment. Chaos and commotion were everywhere as I quickly navigated the people, the policemen, the patrol cars, the investigation vans. I noted a police officer standing in a sectioned-off area. But there was no way I was going to let him stop me from getting to Sid. I raced up the walkway toward the apartment door, but he moved directly in front of me, barring my entrance. I begged with him, please, I have to get in there. It's my daughter's apartment. Please let me go. I need to get in there. Please just let me see my daughter. Please, I need to get to my daughter. Please. He continued to hold me back. Ma'am, I am sorry. You can't go in there. I can't let you go in there, ma'am. I'm sorry, but you can't see your daughter. My knees buckled. The police officers then escorted me past the detectives and the crime scene investigators and the other officers. I looked over my shoulders to see the strangers coming in and out of my daughter's apartment. Cold dread washed over me. I suddenly didn't want to talk to anyone anymore. I didn't want to hear the unspeakable words, confirming what I already knew. Preston had already arrived and was standing there in shock. I will never forget the shattered look on my son's face. There was nothing I could say or do to take his pain away. My sister and her family had arrived. One look at her face and I knew my Sydney was gone. Then Steve arrived. The police did their best to block the entrance of the apartments, but the news of the double homicide traveled like wildfire. My raw, broken heart was now struggling with anger as I felt the violation of our private pain being overtaken by the onlookers and media swarming the apartment complex. Helicopters buzzing overhead, trying to catch a glimpse of what was going on. And all I wanted in the world was to protect my family and have Sid there. We soon learned from the detectives on scene that the other victim was Nehemiah Neo Kaufman. There were no other details to offer except that it was Neo's friend who found them dead in the apartment. My mind was repeatedly playing and replaying what that night must have been like for Sid. Did she fight for her life? Did she try to get away? Did they rape her? Beat her? How long did she suffer? Did she cry for her life? Did they recognize who shot her? These and so many more unthinkable mind movies are forever seared in my mind and continue to haunt me to this day. The detectives began gathering as much information as they could from the people that were there. I did not know many of Nehemiah's friends at the apartment, but I did recognize two of Sydney's friends. One of the girls was Frankie Zappia. Sydney and Frankie had been friends since junior high. Friends that were present all told the police that a person named Shane Valentine was the one who had committed these heinous murders. We would soon learn from the news articles that Shane was a known pimp with a lengthy and violent criminal record who appeared to be untouchable with other pimps when it comes to the LVMPD and the Clark County DA's office. Judge Tobiason has been quoted. Molly Mall's people, in other words, pimps that worked under Molly Mall's permission, were pretty much untouchable. Other news articles explain the connection between Molly Mall and the 5-year FBI investigation into Bison DA corruption. In fact, just a few weeks prior, on October 8th, Shane threatened to kill Nehemiah, Sydney, and Frankie. Tweets, Snapchats, and Instagram began flooding social media. We had 2 kids still in high school who had no idea that their lives were about to dramatically change forever. Steve and I were not going to let them find out about this horrible news so callously, as if a phone call to them would be any better. Friends and family raced to the house before the kids got home to be there when we would call. With no time to even give process the horror, we needed to plan Sydney's funeral. Friends started to arrive from out of town. Everyone except my parents. I never told them Sydney had died. I had visited my mom in Utah and she was very ill and on hospice. I knew when I went to visit her, I was going to say goodbye. I remember thinking on the drive home from Utah I couldn't cry another tear. I was wrong. Tuesday, 2 days after leaving my mother's deathbed, I was now saying goodbye to my brutally murdered daughter. My mom died shortly after Sydney. She never knew. It was Halloween, but no trick-or-treaters would find us at home. Steve and I were driving the 45 minutes to the mortuary in silence. It was going to be the first time we would see our beloved daughter since she was killed. The emotional wrecking ball was relentless. I struggled with the desperate longing to see and hold my baby, but also dreading what we might see. Sydney had been shot in the face. We sat alone in a large room. On one side were several chairs and couches, and a massive open area. Across the room was a wall of swooping curtains acting as a backdrop for what we were about to witness. From the darkness, they slowly entered the side room, wheeling Sydney in on a metal table. Under the recessed lights, I could see the form of her body. Her head was slightly raised, with her neck resting on a cushioned block, and I immediately recognized her long, blonde, beautiful hair. Her arms were resting at her side, and her blanket was draped over her body. When they came to the stop in the center of the room, I started to hyperventilate and sob uncontrollably. I tried to stand up, but my knees wouldn't hold me. I shakily sat back down. I did not want to witness the reality of my sweet daughter's death, that she was truly, truly gone. I was afraid to look at her beautiful face. I pictured her warm, healing smile. Would her lovely face now hold the trauma of her last moments? Would I see the pain of her begging for her life as she stared down the barrel of a gun and they pulled the trigger? As we moved closer, I caught sight of her face and felt the room start spinning. The mortician must have heard me gasp, because he started to apologize profusely. He had spent countless hours working to make her face and her hair more presentable, but it was an impossible task. My daughter looked like she was wearing a horror's mask. A large portion of her face was swollen and misshapen. Her eyes were as black as raccoons. Gunpowder spray had burned her face from the shot taken at close range. But I know another mother reading this will understand when I say that it didn't take long before I saw something more. The love I felt as I touched her delicate arm, and I felt her feminine hand, was overwhelming. She was cold to the touch, which was expected, but as I looked back at her still face, I could still see her innate beauty, not the imperfections of her murder. I brushed her beautiful blonde hair with my hand. I stroked her cheek and I just cried. It wasn't Sydney's lifeless body lying there. I was touching Sydney. I will never forget the sweet gift of being able to touch and hold my daughter once more. She was perfect and still so beautiful in my eyes. I wanted to stay there. In this small moment, my heart felt whole again. The realization that we needed to leave her body there alone was almost unbearable. Over the next several days, information came in quickly with allegations about Shane Valentine being the person of interest in the double homicide. Immediately after the murder, he drove to California, where he was quickly arrested and extradited back to Las Vegas. Were pieces of this grisly puzzle finally falling into place? The murders were violent and brutal. I've heard many times that it was one of the bloodiest crime scenes the investigators had ever seen. I knew that blood they were referring to was Sydney's. Detectives told me Sydney didn't die quickly. The wrecking ball of pain just hits again. At the time, we had no idea the vortex of depravity we were about to get sucked into. Words like corruption, manipulation, shady deals, human trafficking, prostitution, and cover-up were now part of the puzzle. These past 32 months have felt like living in a sickening movie with an unbelievable plot containing too many nauseating twists and turns. Our hearts are continually strangled as we navigate this pendulum of pain, swinging from one horrific detail to another. Just who are the heroes and who are the villains? I can understand why many who have experienced tragedies like ours never come back from that dark place. For me, retreating into depression wasn't an option. I needed the truth. This murder investigation appears to be riddled with corruption, lies, incompetence, and negligence on so many levels. It's as if we are forever unraveling at a pinnacle of pain. When we first learned Sydney's death had been snuffed out forever, I wish I could somehow express to you the emotions of frustration and anger and fear and despair my family and I have felt. It is like a slow, relentless, endless suffocation. The closest thing I compare it to is drowning. Imagine you are being held underwater. Your eyes are wide open. You can see the person standing above you and holding you down, and they are watching you, and you are screaming as loud as you can, but your voice is muffled by the stinging water, and you are choking. The water is filling your mouth, your nose, and your lungs. You know you can't hold your breath forever. You begin flailing as anger and panic surge through your body. You can't get a foothold, and you keep slipping. You desperately try to grab to that person who is holding you down, and then they bring you back up for a quick partial grasp of air, and they shove your head right back down underwater again. This is what it's like for us as some semblance of justice for Sydney and Nehemiah. It is an exhausting, excruciating process. From the initial phone call to witnesses, to the crime scene, to seeing Sydney's tortured body, to the entire ongoing investigation, it is a living hell. It didn't take long to realize the murder investigation was doomed from the start. How does one find the truth when the whole thing is poisoned with deceit and cover-up? Call it a mother's intuition, gut instinct, or just feeling. But I knew things were not as what they seemed, and I was right. About a month or two prior to her murder, Steve and I started to experience a slow escalation of anxiety about Sid. Over time, the warnings and our parents' intuition would kick into high alert. We had no idea the magnitude, the danger, abuse, and control happening in her relationship with Nehemiah. The first we knew Sydney was seeing someone was towards the end of August. Steve and I were working in the yard outside of the house, and we noticed a car pulled up. We could see a guy sitting in the car for an extended period. He didn't get out to introduce himself. He sits in the car and waits. Sydney comes out, gets in the car, and they drive off. It was Nehemiah. Call us old-fashioned, but he did not make a good first impression. Sydney didn't introduce us, so that was concerning for us. That was our first warning sign. A few weeks later, we were waiting for a dentist appointment, and in walked Sydney with Nehemiah. It was the first time I met him. He was very quiet and polite. After the appointment, Sydney and Neo came to the house. He seemed very nice, and we chatted. It was only for a brief moment that I spoke with him. Afterwards, I asked Sydney about Neo, but she didn't say much about him. She only said that he was a busser at the Wynn Resort and Casino. She was very vague when it came to Neo. About a week or so after our appointment, I got a call from our friends who owned the dental practice. She was very concerned about the interaction they witnessed between Nehemiah and Sydney. She said she wasn't sure how to tell me this, but Neo was acting very controlling and would not let Sydney alone during her exam. Neo insisted on remaining in the exam room with her. The dentist had to kick Neo out of the exam room and made him wait in the lobby, and Neo was not happy. They called to tell me how troubled they were about Neo's extreme, possessive, and disturbing behavior. I would like to think that Sydney saw something good in Neo, and that the beginning of their relationship was a healthy one. The interaction between Sydney and Nehemiah, witnessed by others, however, clearly shows the relationship that was anything but healthy. People have described it as dysfunctional and abusive. Sydney had never been in love before, so for her, maybe she viewed this controlling domination as a form of love. I was already concerned now, and my anxiety levels were reaching new heights. I was unsure how to approach Sid, desiring to keep the lines of communication open between us. I could see she was starting to withdraw and become more distant. The Palm restaurant had been closed for the summer due to renovations, and by the time the restaurant was ready to reopen in September, Sydney's money was almost gone. She told us she was moving into an apartment with some girlfriends from work, and she wouldn't have to pay rent at first. We knew something was going on. We told her, live at home, save your money, Sid, focus on school and work. We became very suspicious about these new living conditions and continued to encourage her to live at home. It's hard to tell a 21-year-old what to do. We soon learned Neo was driving Sydney's car. Since I had co-signed on the car with Sydney, I told her that I was not going to allow this. I explained to her that we would be liable if anything happened, and we were not willing to take that risk. Even with all of our demands, Neo continued to drive the car. It finally came to a head on September 24th. I set an appointment for her to go to the dealership to trade in her car and get a different car in her name only. We got into a pretty good argument over the car that morning. Only a few hours later, I get a call from this car salesman who worked with Sid. Hey, Mrs. Land, I had your daughter Sydney here with her friend a few minutes ago. Mrs. Land, this guy is walking around yelling at her, talking down to her and disrespecting her. He told her he didn't want to be driving no effed up Nissan, he wanted to be driving a Dodge or a BMW, and he wanted her to go look someplace else for a car that he could drive. Mrs. Land, if I hadn't been at work, I would have clocked him for speaking to her that way. If that was my daughter, my niece, or my granddaughter, I would do whatever I could to get her away from him. You need to get your daughter away from him. He's a bad dude. I immediately called Sydney and we met for lunch that day. I needed to talk to her. I prayed she would hear my pleas of concern for her safety. I told her I would do everything in my power to keep her safe, but if she continued to go down the road she was going on, it would end tragically for her. To this day, I don't know why I said those specific words. It was almost as if, subconsciously, I knew something bad was going to happen. We soon found out Sydney was living with Neo. Our anxiety and fear only heightened more. We asked where she lived, and she wouldn't tell us. She had never kept anything like this from us before. One time she let it slip she lived off Flamingo and Wallapai. Since I now had the general location, I would spend days driving around in my car. I would wait for people to drive out of a complex and I would follow in behind. I searched from complex to complex. If I could find her car, I knew her apartment would be close by, and I didn't know what to do, but I had to do something. Steve found the lease Sydney had signed for, the Union Apartments. We could not fathom she signed a lease for $1,700 a month. How could our young daughter be stuck in that financial commitment? She was not even back on her feet yet, and now this. We offered to help find her a roommate to offset the rent. We tried to get her out of the lease. We finally told her we would pay the rent just to go get her out and away from that financial bind she had gotten herself into and away from Nehemiah. Things continued to unravel for Sydney. A postcard came in the mail. A speeding ticket had turned into a warrant due to a lack of payment. I was absolutely furious, and that was the final straw. That afternoon I called Sydney, but she didn't answer. I left a scathing message. I drove to her apartment and I found her car parked. I was only there a few minutes before I saw Nehemiah and some other guy were getting into the car. Man, I was so mad. I walked up and I told him, "Get out of the car. Get your shit out of my car." I said, "I'm taking the car," because Sydney had a warrant. Sydney was upset that I took the car, but I did it to protect her. I figured Neo was involved with some very serious stuff based on the amount of weed and other items he took from the car. If she didn't have the car, he couldn't drive it, and he couldn't implicate her or involve her in any of his illegal activities while driving my car. Sydney begged to get her car back. We told her to pay off the warrant, and she would get the car back to trade in. It was a huge inconvenience to not have a car, a huge inconvenience for Nehemiah. We later learned coworkers would offer to give Sydney a ride home from work, but she told them, "Neo will kill me if I get a ride." I am unsure if there was physical abuse in this relationship or not. Sydney's friends told us that after she died that Neo and Frankie were controlling who Sydney spoke to. They would not let Sydney around any of her good friends. When they did call, they were not allowed to speak to Sydney. My daughter Kendall called Sydney, but when Neo answered the phone, Kendall could hear Sydney in the background begging Neo to let her talk to Sid. He wouldn't allow it. Another time Kendall called Sid, and she did answer. Kendall could hear Sydney talking to Neo, explaining, "It's only my sister, so could I please just talk to her?" They were completely controlling her, and we never knew. It was after the murders happened, the detectives told me that Nehemiah was involved in pimping, home invasions, and other illegal activities. Neo was at one time a good kid with a promising basketball career. Per Frankie Zappia, Nehemiah and Shane were involved in illegal things, which led Shane and Nehemiah arguing over a possible gun in the parking lot of Red Rock Casino on the morning of October 8th. Frankie told me that Shane called looking for Nehemiah earlier that morning. He called Sydney's phone looking for Nehemiah, but Frankie answered Sydney's phone. She pretended to be Sydney and started disrespecting Shane and talking trash. Shane thought it was Sydney on the phone. Frankie told me that she told Shane it was really her and not Sydney. Shane said he was going to kill Sydney, Nehemiah, and his girlfriend. Later that same morning, Shane went over and shot into Nehemiah's occupied family home, ran his car into the garage, and threw a rock through the window. We would later learn that the police would close this case due to insufficient evidence for prosecution, even though there were 3 witnesses. It wasn't until after the double homicide that the lead detective, Detective Dosh, realized that the bullet from the drive-by shooting on October 8th had not been retrieved from the Kaufman home. Judge Tobiasen has stated concerning Valentine, "He's out on bail on a burglary. They closed the drive-by shooting case and said that they knew he had did it, and that the DA's got 4 other cases where they have DNA and fingerprints on file on them, and they revoke his bail. How negligent was CSI in the investigation of the Kaufman home that they failed to retrieve the bullets on October 8th? Why did the police department close the case 3 days after the drive-by shooting, knowing that they hadn't collected all of the valuable evidence? Unaware of all these events taking place, Steve and I are having more disturbing premonitions. I remember waking up and Steve was wide awake sitting up in the bed, and I asked him what was going on. He said, "I'm going to get a lawn chair and I'm going to sit in front of Sydney's door. so no one could go in and hurt her. October 11th or 12th, I had picked Sydney up to take her to work. She was absolutely crying and trembling uncontrollably. It scared me to death. I'd never ever seen Sydney like this. I pleaded for Sydney to tell me what was going on. She cried, "Mom, it's just so bad. It's just so bad." I told Sydney that her dad and I would do whatever we had to keep her safe. She begged for her car back. I told her I wouldn't give it to her. As I drove her to work, I turned to look at her, and I said, "Sydney, we will fix everything that is going on. We will make it better. I promise. I'll keep you safe." Sydney's expression turned stoic. "Mom, you can't." Sydney never told me about the death threats from Shane Valentine. She never told me the danger she was in. We begged Sydney to come home. She said everything was okay. We knew she wasn't. We could not force her or drag her away, although we wanted to. I wish to God that we did. The premonitions continued. Another night, Steve was wide awake. "I'm going to move into the apartment with Sydney so I can keep her safe." Sydney saw what Shane Valentine had done to Nehemiah Kaufman's home. Sydney would have never, ever come home to put her family in harm's way. She knew if she told us what was going on, she would have risked our lives to save hers, and she would have never allowed that. Sydney knew Neil for only a few months. In that brief time, her friends and Neil came to quickly control her every move. Her car, her phone, where she went, who she was with. Sydney's associations with Nehemiah Kaufman and Frankie Zappia and their friends cost Sydney her life. She was foreign to their lifestyle and quickly found herself surrounded by wolves in sheep's clothing. After talking to so many family and friends and putting the pieces of the puzzle together, we now realize she was manipulated, terrorized, and lived in fear for her life. Sydney was an innocent victim. She was not the intended target, and yet they shot her in the face. Prior to her last few months alive, Sydney lived a low-key, conservative life. I imagine Neil kept his illegal activities private at first, but once he had his hooks into her, he would have never let her go. It appears she was his property. She provided a car, a house, money, and conveniences he did not have. And I'm sure she paid the price when I took that car. It was probably one of the reasons why she so desperately tried to get it back. I can only imagine the backlash she received for having it taken away. I wish we had known. Sydney was not perfect. She was far from it. I know she made mistakes. I know she felt a lot of pressure to have life all figured out. She wanted to be independent and successful and being out on her own. She wanted to help people and she wanted to make her family proud. She wanted to have fun and she wanted to enjoy her friends. She was compassionate, stubborn, funny, and loyal. You would have liked her. We had an extremely close relationship as mother and daughter. Most of the time, we got along great. Other times, not so great. When I took the car, it was one of the not so great times. Sydney knew I was her mom first and foremost. I may not always have liked her decisions, but she knew I always loved her unconditionally, and I would fight tirelessly and relentlessly for her. She knew I would never let her down, and I never ever will. There have been allegations. Nehemiah was a pimp. Frankie Zappia is a known and convicted prostitute. Many times mentioned throughout this murder investigation were tied to sex trafficking and prostitution. From public sources, we have learned that individuals tied to the murders are also linked to the FBI investigation of vice corruption. Is there any hope in finding the truth? There have been insinuations that Sydney may have been a prostitute. I realize I don't have all the answers. But what I can tell you And everyone knew her, can tell you, Sydney was never ever a promiscuous girl. She never had a serious boyfriend or even flings. She didn't sleep around. It's my understanding that Sydney had severed all ties with Frankie when she learned Frankie was lying about being a prostitute. I know Sydney was hurt and angry because we did not approve of that lifestyle, but knowing Sydney and who she was, Frankie reached out to her from jail in the summer of 2016, and Sydney befriended her again. I don't believe Sydney had an immediate or complete change of heart in that sort of period of time. It simply goes against her very nature. Detectives that told us that it appears they may have been trying to groom her into prostitution. It starts to make sense when you learn about the control, the intimidation, the threats, the terror, the forced withdrawal from her family and her friends. If they were attempting to transform her, they would have needed to use force and severe threats. It is my responsibility to find who killed my daughter. Everything I do, every billboard, every article, every interview, every press conference, every TV show, every podcast is to keep this unsolved murder investigation in the public eye. I'm working desperately to find who killed my daughter against the challenges of sifting through the layers of negligence and corruption surrounding this case. Every one of my efforts will help Nehemiah's family also get the peace and justice they need. Media coverage of the FBI investigation has confirmed corruption involving LVMPD, Vice, and Criminal Intelligence Division, the DA's office, cops accepting money from pimps and sex for prostitutes, the shady deals approved by the DA's office for said pimps and prostitutes. Some of these players are involved in the murder investigation. As a parent, it's hard enough to grieve the loss of your child, but then to learn that the corruption is poisoning any hope of justice is absolutely beyond comprehension. My trust and faith in the LVMPD, the Clark County DA's office, and the Las Vegas justice system is all but obliterated. I wish it wasn't. I believe there are individuals in positions of power who are trying to cover up mistakes at the expense of solving this double homicide. There are so many questions I desperately need answers to. Why did homicide detective Grimmett provide confidential information regarding evidence and suspects pertaining to the homicide investigation to Judge Melanie Andrus Tobiasen? Was he aware he was providing this information to her, that she and her daughter had interactions with Shane Valentine? For the 6 months while Judge Tobiasen and I were communicating, she referenced conversations between herself and Grimmett in text messages and phone conversations, including specific details about evidence found in the apartments and certain records obtained in relation to the case. Judge Melanie Andrus Tobiasen mentioned in the Baltimore Post-Examiner, he confided in her that 3 people were involved in the double murder. The murder happened around 12:30 a.m. on October 26th. Grimmett told her convicted felons Shane Valentine, Dominic Thompson, Damo, went into Neo and Sydney's apartment. Grimmett also told her that evidence points to Frankie Zappia, whose stepdad is a retired police officer. The first detectives who investigated the case, Grimmett, thank God, is someone who knows me and respects me and I have a good relationship with. He tells me for the first 3 or 4 weeks after the murders, while Shane is on the run, what information they have and what proof they have that shows Shane is involved, that they have his phone cell pinging at the apartment. It makes it very hard to have any hope that homicide really wants to solve this case. Was Grimmett trying to sabotage any possibility of using DNA evidence collected in this investigation when he made this comment on national television to Crime Watch Daily on April 27th, 2018, referencing the DNA evidence in the open homicide investigation? His quote, "There are several items that contain DNA evidence, but the problem is these people had lots of friends, lots of associates, lots of people that hung out at that apartment. So working through all of the details of what was relevant and what's not has been a challenge. I mean, when I refer to DNA evidence, there's cigarette butts everywhere, ashtrays full of stuff, drink cups everywhere. So you talk about DNA being in the apartment, there's all kind of stuff, you know? So who knows what's supposed to be there and what wasn't supposed to be there? It's like banging my head against the wall. For 24 months, I have begged my lead detective, sergeants, and lieutenants in homicide. I did not want Grimmett on this case. I believed he was negligent and potentially corrupt. He appeared to be sharing information in an open investigation with Judge Tobiasen, which could potentially damage this case. There would be no hope and no justice for Sidney. Desperate, I provided all of my correspondence to Judge Tobiasen to the homicide detectives in October 2017. Even after all of the documentation I provided, as well as the public statements made by the judge confirming their communications, my requests for his removal from the case have been discarded as trash. I was told 2 weeks ago by the sergeant at homicide that Dosh and Grimmett are still working on this investigation when they have time. The pendulum of pain and confusion continue to swing. I met Judge Melanie Andrus Tobiasen when she reached out to me via Messenger in May of 2017. I was so grateful she did. Finally, it appeared I would have someone in position of power who also believed there was corruption happening. As an influential judge, she lent credibility to the cause that we would undoubtedly fight for. Maybe we would finally see justice for Sidney and Nehemiah and expose the forces trying to bury this corruption. I believed her, and I trusted her, and I confided in her. She was absolutely the peace and the support that I desperately needed. I believed and I appreciated the information Judge Tobiasen made public in exposing the corruption and cover-up in the LVMPD Vice Criminal Intelligence Division, DA's office, and potentially the local FBI office as accurate and truthful. It was the right thing to do. What people didn't know is that while she's going public about crooked cops and the DA's office, she is involved in her own corruption, cover-up, and unethical practices. It appears she used my vulnerabilities concerning my daughter's murder for her own personal agenda. I believed she genuinely wanted to help my family, and I was so wrong. All that was left in her wake was paranoia and dashed hope. It feels like she is the master of puppets. I really did believe she wanted to help me, and there are so many things she never told me and things she intentionally kept secret. It was only until after reading the articles in the Baltimore Post-Examiner that I began to see the possible motives for Judge Tobiasen contacting me. I learned through my readings that Melanie and her daughter Sarah had some very dangerous and volatile interactions with Shane Valentine since their initial encounters in May of 2015. This was 18 months before the murders. I was also shocked to hear a sitting judge had called Shane Valentine's attorney in 2016 and gave Shane a threatening message. If that wasn't bad enough, the judge went to Shane Valentine's house and kicked down or in his door. What is really going on between the judge, her daughter Sarah, and Shane Valentine? I know all too well of a mother trying to protect her child. But why would she put her daughter in harm's way by taunting a man she knows is so dangerous? The judge mentioned Sarah had a best friend named Allie Bowden. Her dad is an LVMPD cop. I read in the articles that Allie introduced Sarah to Shane. Allie allegedly worked as a prostitute for Shane Valentine. My heart skipped a beat when I read that at the time of the murders, Allie Bowden may have been working as a prostitute for Nehemiah Kaufman. Sarah was also friends with Nehemiah. Pieces of this dark and sinister puzzle appeared to be coming together. I was staring at the connections that could not be ignored. What was the real reason the judge contacted me in the first place? The judge told me so many times I could not trust Detective Dosh. She told me Detective Dosh was a longtime friend of Dano Giersdorf, Frankie Zappia's stepfather. She told me Dosh was a liar that could not be trusted. Do not tell him anything because he was never going to solve this case. These were the things I did not want to believe. She told me she was getting evidence and details about the case from Detective Grimmett, and he was the only one I could trust, and the only one that I should speak with at Metro. She told me over the next 6 months of our communication that she would share information he provided. She told me I could never tell anyone we were speaking, and that if I told anyone what we discussed, it would put us both in danger. That me and my family were living in a state of paranoia and high anxiety. She said that I was being followed, my moves were being watched, the police were monitoring my phone calls, my messages, my social media. The police were watching my house. She said we needed to get burner phones so they could not follow our conversations. The fear of losing my child, my husband, or being killed myself was unbearable. I didn't know where to turn. Since the murders happened, I've desperately searched for help. Melanie knew that I had been to the FBI office on several occasions, trying to get them to take over this case. The corruption and negligence were becoming more apparent each day. She told me that her, quote, FBI friend, whom she had been talking to, was the head of the FBI investigation into the LVMPD and vice corruption probe. She told me that it was likely that the evidence in this case, my daughter's homicide, had already been destroyed and that the case would never be solved. One day she called and told me that her FBI friend, that the FBI was finally taking over the murder investigation of Sydney and Nehemiah from Metro. Oh my gosh, I was so excited. Finally, everything I had communicated with Detective Dodd, she told me her FBI friend needed every bit of documentation, photos, emails, texts, everything that I had. I needed to get this to her, information to her ASAP, so she could provide it to her FBI friend. Was this going to be the moment that Sydney would get the justice that she deserved? I gave her everything. Melanie never provided any of my documentation to the FBI. She has stated in interviews that she has all of the correspondence between me and Detective Dosh. I later learned from the FBI that the FBI never ever requested the information from Melanie. They had not, and we're not working on the murder investigation or even looking into it. There's another quick gasp of air before being forced under the water again. It is alleged that Melanie offered a bribe to an undisclosed amount to Ari and Zappia in October 2017. She was to go back to homicide and change the statement she made with them in December of 2016, now stating Shane is the one who killed Connie Land. I never did talk to Grimmett. I believe that once she knew I was not talking to Grimmett, nor sharing my information with them, she created the whole FBI story. It makes me wonder what her real motives are. But the LVMPD has been grossly negligent and completely irresponsible in their handling of this case. A few months ago, I received a call about 11:30 from a gentleman named Doug Papa. I had no idea who he was. And after we had been through, I was somewhat skeptical. Boy, am I grateful for Doug Papa. What he would share with me proved that he was a legitimate investigative journalist with a wealth of factual knowledge. Together, we were able to fill in so many pieces of the puzzle. Finally, things are starting to make sense. I soon learned he wanted to write stories which would uncover the truth not only about the murder, the corruption, the cover-up, the negligence in the case. He is the only journalist that is writing the truth about this story. He is careful to back up all of his stories with proof and documentation from transcribed interviews. The Baltimore Post-Examiner has exposed possible negligence in this case. Since names have been mentioned who are tied to this case, the superiors in the homicide division severed all communication between me and my homicide detective. I am no longer allowed to communicate with the detectives handling this case, and all correspondence has to go through one sergeant. And I can tell you, a year later, that's still absolutely the case. As of May 12th, I have already been told by a representative in homicide that if I continue to share any information discussed with Doug Papa, the Baltimore Post-Examiner, my one point of contact will distance himself from me. I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't.